So now let's move on to a pretty big name here, Robert Moog in New York. And he is responsible for the first commercially accessible voltage-controlled modular synthesizer. And this was a prototype that was unveiled originally at the American Engineering Society convention in the fall of 1964. So pretty early on in the timeline of popular voltage-controlled synthesizers. And at this AES conference or convention, basically the first orders after seeing it, customers placed their first orders to get this instrument. Now, the first production model sold in 1966, so I usually like to say, just for remembering date purposes, remember the Moog is 1966. The first production models is sold, so it's the first commercially sold version of that instrument. By about a year later, it's officially christened the Moog Modular Synthesizer, and they're off and running. Now, this particular instrument had a keyboard controller. Very important to know that about the Moog synthesizer. And the first models consisted primarily of just VCOs and VCAs, the voltage-controlled oscillators and amplifiers, as you recall from the previous two lectures. Over time, though, it eventually did include things like VCFs, envelope generators, ribbon controller, spring reverb, ring modulators, white and pink noise generators, vocoders, frequency shifters, and a sequencer eventually as well. So for the Moog here, the Moog synthesizer, this video I do want you to watch. It's only about 3 minutes long, but check out this video, get a little bit of an idea for some of the sounds of a restored Moog synthesizer from the 60s. And yeah, again, just get acquainted with some of the sounds of this particular synthesizer. Come meet me back here. Now, Wendy Carlos is related to the Moog. She started out actually at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center, if you remember from the last history lecture. And she's basically recognized as the first virtuoso player of the Moog synthesizer. She's very well known for this album called Switched on Bach from 1969. And this particular album contains synthesizer versions of Bach pieces played on the Moog specifically. Now, this was a gold record. It sold more than 500,000 copies, and it received 3 Grammys in that year. So this is a pretty well-received album, one of the first that deals with synthesizers specifically in the sort of popular realm. Even though it's classical music, it turned on a lot of people to accepting the synthesizer. From here, you'll actually see a link in the Canvas module to listen to some Bach on a synthesizer. It's actually not from Switched on Bach. It's not Wendy Carlos. It's actually very hard to find digital versions of that, apparently. So this is someone else doing some Bach on a Moog synthesizer that sounds pretty similar to what Switched on Bach would have sounded like. To continue a little bit with Wendy Carlos, she went on to do much, much more, including composing soundtracks for movies like A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, Tron, lots of well-known movie soundtrack scores there. And additionally, it's worth mentioning that Wendy Carlos actually came out officially as a transgender woman after undergoing sex reassignment surgery in 1979. So especially in that time period, it's a pretty brave thing to do, and especially in this sort of even today male-dominated world of music technology. She was an early advocate for people in the LGBTQ community as well as women within music technology. So moving on from the Moog and Wendy Carlos, we're going to talk a little bit about the San Francisco Tape Music Center for a moment. This was founded in 1962 by Morton Subotnick and Ramon Sender. And this Tape Music Center actually originally grew out of the improvisation group called Sonics that was formed by the San Francisco Conservatory in 1961 by Pauline Oliveros. Ultimately, there were many other composers who were associated with the SFTMC, and they include people like Terry Riley and Steve Reich, which we'll talk about them separately here in a little bit, and of course more. Now, the SFTMC eventually accepted a grant to join the Mills College Center for Contemporary Music in 1967, and Paulina Oliveros at this time is the director of that particular Center for Contemporary Music. So the San Francisco Tape Music Center of itself was fairly short-lived as its own entity, but because it joined with Mills and it fueled this long association of Mills College in Oakland with electronic music and music technology and the like. While we're here, just go stop for a moment and listen to the link in the Canvas module for Pauline Oliveros' Alien Bog from 1967. So, associated with the San Francisco Tape Music Center and Morton Subotnick and Ramon Sender is somebody named Donald Buchla. And he teams up with Subotnick and Sender in 1965, basically, to design an analog synthesizer. So if you recall the Moog, starting in 64 in its early versions, here we are kind of getting early designs for the Buchla synthesizer in 1965. And actually, Buchla had created some of the parts as early as 63. So you might argue that the Buchla came first. But again, here we are at this date, 1966, around the same time that the Moog becomes commercially accessible. The Buchla 100 series modular electronic music system, MEMS, started being sold commercially. So the Moog and the Buchla on the timeline are roughly hand in hand, but you can see have a little bit of difference in where their designs are at. So it's often considered that the Moog sort of kind of comes first a little bit. Additionally, the Moog synthesizer ends up being a bit more popular in the long run. So really about the same time, but the Moog kind of edges it out a little bit in sort of its presence in the world a little bit earlier. Now, some differences here between the Buchla synthesizer and the Moog synthesizer. There's no keyboard like on the Moog. That's key here. Pun, I guess, intended, maybe reluctantly so. But instead, it actually used touch-sensitive plates. So you can see those here, the little blue and silver plates. The Buchla synthesizer offered greater ability to actually modify timbre on the outset than the Moog synthesizer did. And it allowed for specifically programming of patterns of repeating control voltages that could trigger patterns of repeated sounds. So what is this? This is the first sequencer, which we'll talk more about specifically later on. So just know that there's the Moog synthesizer, there's the Buchla synthesizer. Commercially, they're available around the same time in 1966, but they're fairly different in what they try to do. The Moog does not have a keyboard, and it has the first synthesizer. And excuse me, I meant the Buchla synthesizer does not have the keyboard, and it does have the first sequencer, unlike the Moog. Take a moment now and check out the excerpt in the Canvas module for The Wild Bull from Morton Subotnick using the Buchla synthesizer, 1968.